In the small, dusty town of Rustburg, South Carolina, life revolved around one thing: the coal mine. It wasn't just a place where people worked, it was the heartbeat of the community. Every morning, as the sun began to rise over the hills, hundreds of men would gather at the entrance of the mine, their faces smeared with dirt from the day before. Among them was Samuel Johnson, a man in his late 30s who had spent more than half his life digging deep into the earth. Samuel wasn't someone who talked much. He carried himself with quiet strength, always focused on the job ahead. But what set him apart wasn't just his work ethic, it was how he handled the challenges life threw at him. Being black in a predominantly white workforce came with its own struggles. Some of his co-workers treated him differently, whispering behind his back or giving him the hardest tasks. Yet Samuel never let bitterness take root. Instead, he poured all his energy into doing his best, knowing that hard work spoke louder than words ever could. Every day started the same way for Samuel. Before the rooster even crowed, he'd be up and out of bed, careful not to wake Evelyn, his wife. She supported him through everything, always reminding him that his worth wasn't defined by what others thought of him. After pulling on his boots and grabbing his lunch pail, Samuel would walk the familiar path to the mine. The air there was thick with dust, and the ground beneath his feet felt heavy, almost alive, like it knew the weight of the lives depending on it. The miners were a mix of personalities. There were gruff old-timers who'd been working the tunnel since they were teenagers, young guys trying to make ends meet, and everyone in between. Mr. Carlisle, the boss, stood out among them. Unlike some of the other supervisors, he didn't treat Samuel poorly because of the color of his skin. Sure, he was strict, but he also appreciated good work when he saw it. Over time, Samuel earned a level of respect from Mr. Carlisle that few others did. They weren't friends exactly, but there was mutual trust, a rare thing in those days. One chilly morning, as the miners gathered outside the shaft, an uneasy feeling hung in the air. Rumors had been swirling about cracks forming deeper in the tunnels. Some said the supports weren't holding up well enough. Others shrugged it off, saying mines were always dangerous and worrying wouldn't change anything. Samuel listened quietly, his eyes scanning the group. He'd seen plenty of collapses in his years underground, and something about today felt different. Still, he pushed the thought aside and followed the crew down into the darkness. The mine swallowed them whole, its narrow passages lit only by the dim glow of headlamps. The sound of picks hitting rock echoed endlessly, blending with the occasional cough or muttered conversation. Samuel worked steadily, his hands moving with practiced precision. Despite the physical toll of the job, he found a kind of peace down there. The world above, with its prejudices and hardships, felt far away. Underground, everyone faced the same risks, whether rich or poor, black or white. But peace doesn't last long in places like this. As the hours ticked by, a low rumble shook the walls. At first, no one paid much attention. Tremors were common after all. But then came another vibration, stronger this time. The lights flickered and suddenly chaos erupted. A deafening crash filled the air as part of the ceiling collapsed, sending clouds of dust billowing through the tunnel. Miners scrambled, shouting to each other, unsure of which way to run. Samuel froze for a split second, his heart pounding. Then instinct kicked in. He grabbed the nearest person, a young miner, and pulled him towards safety. Around them, the once sturdy beams groaned under the pressure, threatening to give way completely. Through the confusion, Samuel heard someone call out. It was Mr. Carlisle, trapped under rubble along with several others. Without hesitation, Samuel moved toward the voice, knowing full well the danger he was stepping into. What happened next would change not only Samuel's life, but the lives of everyone in Rustburg. Little did he know saving his boss was just the beginning of a journey that would test his courage, challenge society's rules, and ultimately transform him in ways he couldn't imagine. The collapse came without warning, like a monster waking from its slumber. One moment, the miners were focused on their work, chipping away at the coal seam with steady hands. The next, the ground beneath them seemed to shudder violently, as if the earth itself had turned against them. A deafening roar filled the narrow tunnel, a sound so loud it drowned out even the shouts of panic that followed. Dust exploded into the air, choking and blinding everyone in its path. Samuel reacted quickly, his instincts honed by years of working in the unpredictable depths of the mine. He threw himself against the wall, shielding his face with his arm, as chunks of rock and timber rained down around him. His heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. Panic wouldn't help anyone now. Through the chaos, he could hear cries echoing through the darkness, some desperate, others muffled by fear or injury. "Stay together," Samuel shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. "We need to find cover." He grabbed the nearest miner, a young man who looked barely old enough to grow a beard, and pulled him toward a relatively stable section of the tunnel. The kid's eyes were wide with terror, his hands trembling as he clutched his helmet. Samuel gave him a firm pat on the shoulder. "You're gonna be okay," he said, though he wasn't entirely sure those words were true. Right now, survival depended on quick thinking and teamwork, and Samuel knew he had to lead by example. As the dust began to settle, the reality of the situation became clear. Part of the ceiling had caved in, blocking the main passage that led back to the surface. The air grew thick with tension as the trapped miners realized they were cut off from escape. Worse still, water started seeping through cracks in the walls, pooling ominously on the floor. If they didn't act fast, the rising water would make their chances of getting out even slimmer. That's when Samuel heard it, a faint cry for help coming from deeper inside the collapsed area. It was Mr. Carlyle's voice, strained but unmistakable. Samuel's stomach tightened. His boss was trapped somewhere beyond the rubble along with a few other miners. Without wasting another second, Samuel grabbed a flashlight and moved closer to assess the damage. The sight made his blood run cold. The fallen rocks formed an almost impenetrable barrier, jagged edges jutting out like teeth ready to bite anyone who dared approach. But Samuel didn't hesitate. He knelt down, examining the pile carefully. Some of the larger boulders looked unstable, threatening to shift at any moment. Digging through this mess would be dangerous, not just for him, but for anyone else who tried to follow. "We can't wait for rescue teams," Samuel muttered under his breath. By the time help arrived, it might already be too late. He turned to the group of shaken miners huddled nearby. "I'm going in," he announced firmly. "I'll try to clear a path. You guys keep an eye on the water level and shout if anything changes." A few of the men protested, urging him not to risk his life, but Samuel shook his head. "If we don't do something, none of us are getting out of here alive." With that, he rolled up his sleeves and got to work. Using nothing more than his bare hands and a small pickaxe, Samuel began chipping away at the debris. Each movement sent fresh clouds of dust swirling into the air, making it harder to breathe. His muscles burned with exhaustion, and sweat dripped down his face, mixing with the grime coating his skin. Still, he pressed on, driven by sheer determination. Hours passed, or maybe it was only minutes. Time blurred together in the suffocating darkness. Every time a rock shifted, Samuel held his breath, bracing for another collapse. Yet somehow he kept moving forward, inch by agonizing inch. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he broke through to the other side. There, crumpled amidst the wreckage, was Mr. Carlyle. Blood trickled from a gash on his forehead, and his leg was pinned under a heavy beam. Despite his injuries, he managed a weak smile when he saw Samuel. "Knew you'd come," he rasped, his voice barely audible over the dripping water. Samuel didn't waste time responding. He worked quickly to free Mr. Carlyle, enlisting the help of the other trapped miners to lift the beam off his leg. Once they had him stabilized, Samuel led the group back toward the makeshift path he'd created. The journey was slow and treacherous, every step fraught with danger. But Samuel refused to let anyone fall behind. When they finally emerged into the open air, blinking against the harsh sunlight, the entire town seemed to have gathered at the mine's entrance. Cheers erupted as the survivors stumbled out, coughing and covered in dirt. Samuel brought up the rear, supporting Mr. Carlyle as they took their first shaky steps onto solid ground. For a moment, all Samuel could do was stand there, catching his breath while the crowd swarmed around them. People patted him on the back, calling him a hero. Reporters snapped photos, their cameras flashing like lightning bugs in the daylight. But Samuel barely noticed. His mind was still reeling from everything that had happened underground. Saving his boss had been instinctual, a reflex born out of years of facing danger head-on. What he hadn't expected was how this single act of bravery would ripple outward, changing not just his own life, but the lives of everyone around him. Little did Samuel know the hardest part of his journey was yet to come. The moment Samuel stepped out of the mine, blinking against the bright sunlight, he felt like a man reborn. The cool breeze brushed against his face, carrying with it the faint smell of pine trees and fresh earth. It was a stark contrast to the suffocating darkness he'd just escaped. Around him, the crowd erupted into cheers, their voices blending into a cacophony of relief and celebration. Women hugged each other tightly, tears streaming down their faces. Men clapped Samuel on the back, shouting words of gratitude that blurred together in the chaos. But Samuel didn't feel like a hero. He stood there, dazed, still gripping Mr. Carlyle's arm as if letting go might send them both tumbling back into the abyss they'd narrowly escaped. His body ached from hours of digging and hauling debris, and his mind was racing with fragments of what had happened underground. The sound of collapsing rocks, the sight of trapped miners fighting for air, the weight of knowing one wrong move could mean disaster. For all the noise around him, Samuel felt strangely distant, like he was watching the scene unfold from somewhere else entirely. Reporters pushed through the crowd, microphones in hand, cameras flashing like fireflies. "How did you do it?" one asked, shoving a recorder toward Samuel's face. Another shouted, "What went through your mind when you realized the tunnel was collapsing?" Samuel blinked at them, unsure how to respond. How could he explain something he barely understood himself? All he'd done was act on instinct, driven by the need to save lives, including his boss's. Before he could stammer out an answer, Mr. Carlyle spoke up. Leaning heavily on Samuel for support, his voice was weak but clear. "This man saved us," he said, raising a shaky hand to point at Samuel. "If it weren't for him, none of us would be standing here right now." His words silenced the reporters momentarily, drawing everyone's attention. Samuel shifted uncomfortably under the sudden spotlight, wishing he could disappear into the background. As the commotion continued, Evelyn, Samuel's wife, pushed her way through the throng of people. Her eyes were red from crying, but she wore a look of fierce determination as she wrapped her arms around him. "I knew you'd come back," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But don't you ever scare me like that again." Samuel hugged her tightly, feeling a lump rise in his throat. In that moment, surrounded by his family and neighbors, he allowed himself a brief flicker of pride. Maybe he had done something worth celebrating. The days that followed were a whirlwind. News of the collapse spread far beyond Rustburg, making headlines in newspapers across the state. Reporters descended on the small mining town, eager to capture every detail of the dramatic rescue. Samuel found himself at the center of it all, fielding questions about his bravery and recounting the harrowing ordeal over and over again. At first he tried to brush off the attention, insisting he'd only done what anyone else would have done. But deep down, he couldn't deny the significance of what had happened. Saving his boss and helping bring the others to safety was no small feat. Not everyone was happy about the newfound fame, though. Some of the white miners grumbled under their breath, resentful that Samuel, a black man, was getting so much recognition. They muttered things like, "He just got lucky," or "Anyone could have done what he did." Others avoided him altogether, refusing to meet his gaze when they passed him on the street. Samuel noticed these reactions, of course, but he chose not to engage. He'd spent years proving himself in the mines, enduring slights and insults, without letting bitterness take root. This time wouldn't be any different. Still, the tension weighed on him. Late at night, after Evelyn had fallen asleep, Samuel would sit by the window staring out at the quiet town bathed in moonlight. He replayed the events of the collapse in his mind, wondering if he'd made the right decision to step forward. Had he risked his life simply because it was the right thing to do, or because he wanted to prove something to those who doubted him? The line between courage and defiance felt blurry, and Samuel wasn't sure where one ended and the other began. Despite the mixed reactions, there were moments of genuine warmth that reminded Samuel why he loved this community, flaws and all. Neighbors stopped by to thank him personally, bringing baskets of food or jars of homemade jam. Kids ran up to him on the street, asking wide-eyed questions about the rescue. Even some of the miners who'd initially been skeptical began to soften, acknowledging his skill and leadership in hushed tones. These small gestures meant more to Samuel than any headline ever could. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Samuel sat on the porch with Evelyn. She leaned her head against his shoulder, her presence a comforting anchor in the storm of emotions swirling inside him. "You know," she said softly, "you've always been my hero. But now the whole world sees what I've known all along." Samuel chuckled, shaking his head. "I'm no hero, Evie. I just did what needed to be done." Evelyn smiled, squeezing his hand. "Maybe. But sometimes doing what needs to be done is exactly what makes someone a hero." Her words lingered in the air long after they fell silent, carried away by the gentle breeze. Samuel didn't fully believe her, not yet. But he couldn't deny the truth in what she said. Life had a funny way of testing people, pushing them to their limits and forcing them to rise above. And while Samuel didn't ask for the attention or accolades, he couldn't ignore the fact that his actions had sparked something bigger, a ripple effect that was starting to change the dynamics of the town. Little did he know, this was only the beginning. The collapse had brought him closer to his co-workers, yes, but it had also set the stage for challenges he hadn't anticipated. As the dust settled, both literally and figuratively, Samuel would soon discover that being a hero came with its own set of complications. The days after the collapse were a blur of activity for Samuel. The town buzzed with talk of his bravery, and strangers began treating him differently, some with admiration, others with curiosity, and a few with thinly veiled resentment. At first, Samuel tried to brush it off, telling himself that life would eventually return to normal. But the more attention he received, the harder it became to ignore the growing divide in Rustburg. Mr. Carlyle, still recovering from his injuries, didn't hesitate to publicly praise Samuel at every opportunity. During a community meeting held to address safety concerns following the disaster, he stood up in front of a packed room and spoke passionately about Samuel's role in saving lives. "If not for this man," he said, pointing directly at Samuel, who sat awkwardly in the back row, "many of us wouldn't be here today." His courage and quick thinking turned tragedy into survival. The crowd erupted into applause, but Samuel couldn't help noticing the scowls on a few faces near the aisle front. Some of the miners shifted uncomfortably in their seats, avoiding eye contact. One older miner muttered loud enough for those around him to hear, "It wasn't just him. We all worked hard down there." Another chimed in under his breath, "Yeah, but now everyone's acting like he's some kind of saint." Samuel felt the weight of their words, even though they weren't directed at him outright. He knew what was happening. To some of these men, his sudden rise to recognition felt like an intrusion, a disruption of the unspoken rules that had governed their world for so long. In their eyes, Samuel wasn't just a miner. He was a black man stepping into a spotlight, reserved for someone else. And while Mr. Carlyle's praise was well-intentioned, it only seemed to fan the flames of resentment simmering beneath the surface. At home, Evelyn noticed the change in Samuel almost immediately. Normally calm and steady, he started snapping at little things like when she accidentally burned dinner or when their youngest child spilled milk on the table. One night, as they sat together on the porch watching the stars, Evelyn finally confronted him. "What's going on with you?" she asked gently, her voice laced with concern. "You've been different since the rescue." Samuel sighed, leaning forward to rest his elbows on his knees. For a moment, he stared at the ground, searching for the right words. "It's complicated," he admitted. "People are looking at me differently now. Like I'm supposed to be something I'm not. Evelyn nodded slowly, understanding without needing further explanation. She reached over and placed a hand on his shoulder. You saved lives, Samuel. That's nothing to apologize for. But I know how hard it is when people can't see past the color of your skin, or when they feel threatened by your success. Her words struck a chord deep within him. Success? Was that what this was? Samuel hadn't thought of himself as successful before. Sure, he took pride in his work and provided for his family, but he'd never imagined being celebrated for it. Now suddenly, doors were opening that had always been closed to him, and while part of him wanted to step through, another part worried about what lay on the other side. A few days later, Mr. Carlyle called Samuel into his office. The room smelled faintly of cigar smoke and polished wood, a stark contrast to the gritty tunnels where Samuel spent most of his time. Sitting behind his desk, Mr. Carlyle looked unusually serious. I need to talk to you about something important, he began, gesturing for Samuel to take a seat. Samuel hesitated, unsure what to expect. Over the years, he'd learned to read between the lines when it came to conversations with authority figures. Was this about the collapse? Had someone complained about him? As he settled into the chair, his mind raced with possibilities. I want to offer you a promotion, Mr. Carlyle said bluntly, cutting straight to the point. You've earned it, Samuel. Your leadership during the rescue proved you're capable of far more than just digging coal. I'd like you to become the new foreman, one of the supervisors overseeing operations in the mine. For a moment, Samuel was too stunned to respond. Foreman? Him? It was unheard of. A black man holding such a position in Rustburg's mines. The idea sent a jolt of excitement through him, quickly followed by a wave of doubt. Sir, he said, cautiously, are you sure about this? There's already tension among the crew. If I take this role, it'll only get worse. Mr. Carlyle leaned back in his chair, folding his hands across his chest. I won't lie to you, Samuel. There will be pushback. Some of the men won't like it, at least not at first, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't do what's right. You've earned this position, plain and simple, and if anyone has a problem with it, they can take it up with me. Samuel appreciated the sentiment, but he couldn't shake the unease gnawing at him. Accepting the promotion meant stepping into uncharted territory, not just for himself, but for the entire town. It would challenge the status quo in ways that might make life even harder for him and his family. Yet, at the same time, turning it down felt like letting fear dictate his choices. That night, Samuel brought the conversation to Evelyn. They sat at the kitchen table, the soft hum of crickets drifting in through the open window. What do you think? He asked, his voice heavy with uncertainty. Should I take it? Evelyn didn't answer right away. Instead, she studied him carefully, her brow furrowed in thought. Finally, she spoke. This isn't just about you, Samuel, it's bigger than that. If you say no, nothing changes, but if you say yes... She paused, choosing her words carefully. If you say yes, you give hope to people who don't have much of it. You show them that maybe, just maybe, things can be different. Her words lingered in the air, echoing in Samuel's mind long after they went to bed. He tossed and turned that night, wrestling with the decision. By morning, he still didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for certain. Staying silent had never moved mountains. Change required risk, and if anyone understood the cost of standing still, it was Samuel Johnson. The next day, he walked into Mr. Carlyle's office and accepted the promotion. It wasn't an easy choice, but it was the right one, for himself, for his family, and for the future he hoped to build. What Samuel didn't realize was that this decision would set off a chain reaction, testing not only his strength but also the fragile fabric of the community he called home. The day Samuel officially became foreman, the atmosphere in the mine was tense. Word had spread quickly among the miners, and while some greeted him with nods of respect, others made no effort to hide their disapproval. As Samuel walked through the tunnels on his first morning in the new role, he could feel eyes following him, some curious, some hostile. The weight of those stairs pressed down on him like the layers of rock above their heads. His first task, as foreman, was to assign jobs for the day. It was a routine responsibility, one that had been handled by supervisors for years without much fuss. But when Samuel called out assignments, a few miners exchanged skeptical glances. One older man, known for his gruff demeanor, muttered under his breath loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, "Since when does he get to tell us what to do?" Samuel ignored the comment, focusing instead on keeping things moving. He reminded himself why he'd accepted the promotion, to prove that leadership wasn't about skin color or background. It was about doing what was best for the team. Still, the tension in the air was palpable, and it didn't take long for small acts of resistance to surface. Over the next few days, subtle sabotage began creeping into the workflow. Tools went missing or were left in disrepair. Equipment malfunctions slowed progress, forcing delays that frustrated even the most patient workers. At first, Samuel tried to address these issues directly, confronting the offenders calmly but firmly. "If there's a problem," he'd say, "we can talk about it. But messing with the gear isn't helping anyone." Some backed down when confronted, mumbling apologies or blaming accidents. Others doubled down, their resentment growing louder. During lunch breaks, clusters of men gathered in corners of the break room, whispering conspiratorially. Samuel knew they were talking about him. He could see it in the way they stopped mid-sentence whenever he entered the room. Evelyn noticed the toll this was taking on her husband. Each evening, she watched as he trudged home covered in coal dust, his shoulders heavier than usual. Gone was the quiet confidence he once carried. Now, doubt shadowed his every step. One night, after Samuel spent nearly an hour pacing the living room, Evelyn finally spoke up. "You're letting them win," she said softly, her voice cutting through the silence. Samuel stopped mid-stride, turning to face her. "What am I supposed to do, Evie? Every time I try to fix something, it just gets worse. They don't want me here, not really." "That's not true," Evelyn replied, her tone firm yet kind. "There are people who respect you. You've earned that. But if you let their negativity bring you down, then they've already won. Don't give them that power." Her words struck a nerve. Samuel realized she was right. He couldn't control how others felt about him, but he could decide how he responded. The next morning, he arrived at the mine earlier than usual, determined to set a different tone. Instead of jumping straight into assigning tasks, he gathered the crew together for a quick meeting before heading underground. "I know things have been tough lately," he began, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. "And I know some of you aren't happy with me being foreman. That's okay. I don't expect everyone to agree with this decision. But here's the thing, we're all stuck down here together and we all want the same thing, to make it home safe at the end of the day. So let's focus on that. If there's something I'm doing wrong, tell me. If there's a better way to handle things, I'm open to hearing it. But sabotaging the work doesn't help anyone, it puts all of us in danger." The room fell silent. Some of the miners shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. A young worker sitting near the front nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. Finally, one of the older men cleared his throat. "Look," he said gruffly, "it's not personal. It's just, change is hard, especially around here." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Samuel nodded, understanding, more than the man probably realized. "I get that," he said. "Change is hard. But maybe it's time we start making it work for us instead of against us." The meeting ended without fanfare, but something shifted after that. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the resistance began to soften. Not everyone warmed up to Samuel overnight, but a few started showing signs of acceptance. When equipment broke down, they reported it instead of ignoring it. When arguments flared over assignments, they brought their concerns to Samuel rather than grumbling behind his back. Even Mr. Carlyle noticed the difference. During one of their regular check-ins, he pulled Samuel aside and gave him a rare smile. "You're handling this better than I expected," he admitted. "Not many people could keep their cool under this kind of pressure." Samuel shrugged modestly. "It's not perfect," he said, "but it's getting better, little by little." Despite the progress, challenges remained. Anonymous notes started appearing in Samuel's locker, written in blocky letters to disguise the handwriting. "Quit while you're ahead," one read. "No one wants you here." Another warned, "Watch your back, you never know what might happen." Each message sent a chill down his spine, but Samuel refused to let fear dictate his actions. Instead, he shared the notes with Mr. Carlyle, who immediately launched an investigation. Word of the threat spread through the mine, sparking mixed reactions. Some miners condemned the cowardice of targeting Samuel anonymously, while others remained eerily silent. For Samuel, the hardest part wasn't the threats themselves. It was wondering whether the hostility would ever truly fade. One evening, as he sat alone in the dim light of the kitchen, Evelyn placed a cup of tea in front of him. "You're stronger than they think," she said simply. "Stronger than you think, too." Samuel looked at her, gratitude swelling in his chest. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for sure. Giving up wasn't an option. This fight wasn't just for him. It was for every person who deserved a fair chance, regardless of where they came from or what they looked like. And so, Samuel kept going, day by day, proving himself not just as a miner or a foreman, but as a man who refused to be broken by hate. What he didn't realize was that his perseverance was planting seeds of change, seeds that would eventually grow into something far greater than he could have imagined. The tension in the mine didn't disappear overnight. If anything, it simmered just beneath the surface, waiting for the smallest spark to ignite it again. Samuel knew that while some of the miners had begun to accept his leadership, others still harbored resentment that sometimes spilled over in dangerous ways. One afternoon, as the crew worked on reinforcing a particularly unstable section of the tunnel, disaster struck once more. It started with a loud creak, followed by a sharp crack. The sound was unmistakable. The wooden beams supporting the ceiling were giving way. Panic rippled through the group as they scrambled to secure the area, but their efforts were hindered by poor communication and misplaced tools. Someone shouted that a jackhammer was missing, and another accused a coworker of deliberately leaving it behind. Tempers flared, voices rose, and chaos threatened to take hold. Samuel stepped forward, raising his hands to quiet the commotion. "Enough," he barked, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "Arguing isn't going to fix this. We need to work together, now, or we're all in trouble." For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, the men began to follow his instructions. They formed a makeshift chain to pass materials, coordinated their movements, and managed to stabilize the beams before the collapse worsened. Though the immediate danger passed, the incident left everyone shaken, including Samuel. As they regrouped outside the affected area, one of the younger miners spoke up, his face pale with fear. "That almost turned deadly," he said, his voice trembling. "If we hadn't acted fast..." He didn't finish the sentence, but everyone understood what he meant. Accidents happened often enough in the mines, but this felt different. This wasn't just bad luck, it was carelessness fueled by division, and Samuel knew it couldn't continue. Later that evening, Samuel met with Mr. Carlyle to discuss what had happened. The older man listened intently, his expression grim. "This is exactly why I promoted you," he said finally. "You see things others don't, but clearly there's still work to be done." Samuel nodded. "It's not just about tools being misplaced or arguments breaking out, it's deeper than that. There's anger festering down there, and if we don't address it, someone's going to get hurt, or worse." Mr. Carlyle agreed, and together, they came up with a plan. Over the next few weeks, they implemented stricter safety protocols and held mandatory training sessions for the entire workforce. These weren't just lectures on how to use equipment properly. They were opportunities to remind everyone of their shared responsibility to each other. "We're a team," Samuel emphasized during one session. "What happens to one of us affects all of us. If we don't look out for each other, who will?" To reinforce this message, Samuel also introduced regular meetings where workers could voice concerns without fear of retaliation. At first, participation was sparse. Many miners were hesitant to speak openly, especially in front of Samuel. But gradually, trust began to build. A few brave souls started sharing honest feedback about unsafe conditions, unresolved tensions, and even personal struggles outside the mine. Each meeting became a chance to break down barriers and foster understanding. One breakthrough moment came when an older miner named Tom stood up during one of these gatherings. Tom had been one of Samuel's harshest critics since the promotion, often grumbling about how things used to be better back in the day. But now, standing awkwardly in front of the group, he admitted something surprising. "I've been hard on you," he said, glancing at Samuel. "Not because I think you're doing a bad job, I guess I was scared. Change scares me." The cow. Room fell silent as Tom continued. "But today, when that beam started cracking, I saw how you handled it. You didn't panic. You kept your head straight and got us working together. That's leadership. And maybe it's time I stopped fighting against change and started helping make it happen." His words hung in the air, raw and unpolished, but they carried weight. Other miners nodded in agreement, some murmuring words of support. Samuel felt a lump rise in his throat. For so long, he'd focused on proving himself, on earning respect through action alone. But hearing Tom's admission reminded him that true progress required more than just individual effort. It needed collective buy-in. Word of the meetings spread beyond the mine, drawing attention from the wider community. Local newspapers picked up the story, highlighting Samuel's approach to fostering unity among the workers. Some residents praised the initiative, saying it was long overdue. Others remained skeptical, accusing Samuel of grandstanding or trying to push an agenda. But none of that mattered to him. What mattered was seeing the slow but steady shift in attitudes underground. Even those who had once resisted him began to come around. Small gestures, a nod of acknowledgement, a muttered thanks after a long shift, spoke volumes. One day, as Samuel walked through the tunnels, he noticed a young miner sketching diagrams of potential improvements to the ventilation system. When he asked about it, the man grinned sheepishly. "Just thought I'd pitch in," he said. "You always say we're a team, right? Well, here's my contribution." Moments like these gave Samuel hope. He realized that while hatred and prejudice ran deep, so did resilience and humanity. By creating space for people to connect, not as black or white, foreman or laborer, but as human beings sharing the same struggles, he was planting seeds of change that might one day grow into something transformative. Still, Samuel knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Resentment doesn't vanish overnight, and progress often feels painfully slow. Yet every step forward, no matter how small, brought him closer to a vision he'd always believed in. A world where people judged each other not by the color of their skin or the titles they held, but by the content of their character. And though he couldn't see it yet, Samuel's journey was far from over. The challenges he faced and the lessons he learned would ripple outward, touching lives far beyond the confines of the mine. Little did he know, his story was about to inspire others in ways he never imagined possible. As weeks turned into months, the changes Samuel had sparked began to take root in ways he hadn't fully anticipated. The mine itself seemed different, quieter, steadier, more united. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of tension, sharp words exchanged in the heat of frustration. But those incidents became fewer and farther between. What truly stood out was how people responded when things went wrong. Instead of pointing fingers or retreating into old prejudices, they worked together to solve problems. Slowly but surely, Samuel's vision of teamwork and mutual respect was becoming a reality. One crisp autumn morning, as the miners gathered for their daily briefing, an unexpected visitor arrived at the site, a journalist from a national newspaper. She introduced herself as someone sent to write a feature story about Samuel and the transformation happening in Rustberg's mine. Her presence stirred mixed reactions among the crew. Some saw it as validation of their hard work, while others grumbled that outsiders didn't need to meddle in their business. Samuel, however, welcomed her with cautious optimism. He knew this was an opportunity not just for himself, but for the entire town. Over the course of several days, the journalist shadowed Samuel, observing his interactions with the miners and interviewing workers from all levels of the operation. At first, many were hesitant to open up, unsure of what she might report. But as she asked thoughtful questions about the challenges they faced, the bonds they'd formed, and the pride they took in their work, they began to share openly. One older miner, who had once been one of Samuel's harshest critics, told her, "At first I thought having him as foreman would be trouble, but now, I can't imagine anyone else doing the job like he does." The article, when it was published, painted a vivid picture of life in the mine and the man at its center. It highlighted Samuel's bravery during the collapse, his determination to bridge divides, and his unwavering commitment to safety and fairness. The headline read, "From Hero to Leader, How One Man is Changing the Face of Rustburg." Copies of the paper made their way into every home in town, sparking conversations at dinner tables and coffee shops. People who had never given much, thought to the miners' struggles, now saw them and Samuel in a new light. But the impact of the article extended far beyond Rustburg. Letters poured in from across the country, addressed to Samuel and the mining company. Some came from fellow workers in other industries, thanking Samuel for inspiring them to push for better conditions in their own workplaces. Others were from families touched by similar stories of courage and resilience. A few even arrived from civil rights organizations, praising Samuel's efforts to break down racial barriers in a field long dominated by inequality. For Samuel, reading these letters was both humbling and overwhelming. He hadn't set out to become a symbol of change. He'd simply wanted to do his job well and ensure everyone around him stayed safe. Yet here he was, being celebrated not just as a miner or a foreman, but as a leader whose actions had sparked hope in places where hope felt scarce. The attention brought challenges too. Some locals grew resentful, accusing Samuel of seeking fame or trying to make Rustburg look bad on a national stage. Others worried that the spotlight would bring unwanted scrutiny to the town's deep-rooted issues. Even within the mine, a handful of workers bristled at the idea of being part of someone else's story. But for every negative voice, there were dozens more offering support. Neighbors stopped Samuel on the street to thank him. Strangers visiting Rustburg asked to shake his hand. And young miners, inspired by his journey, began approaching him for advice. One evening, after a particularly long day, Samuel found himself sitting on the porch with Evelyn. The air was cool, carrying the earthy scent of fallen leaves. In his lap lay a stack of letters he hadn't yet finished reading. Evelyn glanced at him, noticing the weary slump of his shoulders. "You're carrying a lot," she said softly. "Are you okay?" Samuel sighed, running a hand over his face. "I don't know, Evie. Sometimes it feels like maybe I'm not cut out for this. People keep looking to me for answers, but I'm just figuring things out as I go." Evelyn smiled gently, reaching over to take his hand. "That's exactly why they look to you. You're real, Samuel. You're not pretending to have everything figured out. You're showing them it's possible to grow and learn, even when things are hard." Her words lingered in the quiet night air, settling into Samuel's heart like a balm. She was right. He wasn't perfect, and he didn't have all the answers. But maybe that was the point. Maybe leadership wasn't about knowing everything. It was about being willing to listen, to adapt, and to stand firm in the face of adversity. The turning point came during a community meeting held in the town hall. The room buzzed with energy as residents packed inside, eager to discuss the future of Rustburg. For years, such meetings had devolved into arguments over petty grievances or unresolved tensions. This time, though, the atmosphere felt different. When Samuel rose to speak, the crowd fell silent, their eyes fixed on him. "I won't lie to you," he began, his voice steady despite the weight of so many expectations. "Things aren't perfect here. We've got a long way to go before we can say we've truly moved past the divisions that have held us back for so long. But I believe we're capable of getting there. Because I've seen it happen, in the mine, in the way we've started working together, supporting each other and holding ourselves accountable." He paused, scanning the faces before him. Some nodded in agreement, Others sat quietly, processing his words. Change doesn't come easy, he continued. It takes effort, patience, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. But if we keep pushing forward, if we keep believing in each other, I know we can build something better. Not just for ourselves, but for our kids and grandkids. When he finished speaking, applause erupted throughout the room. It wasn't polite clapping either. It was heartfelt, sustained, and full of emotion. Several people approached him afterward, shaking his hand and expressing gratitude. One elderly woman hugged him tightly, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You've given us hope," she whispered. "Don't ever stop." In that moment, Samuel realized something profound. His journey wasn't just about proving himself or earning respect. It was about creating ripples of change that reached far beyond him. Every decision he'd made, every challenge he'd faced had contributed to something bigger. A shift in mindset, a breaking down of walls, a planting of seeds that would continue to grow long after he was gone. And yet, as proud as he felt, Samuel knew his work wasn't done. There were still battles to fight, obstacles to overcome, and dreams to chase. But for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to feel a sense of peace. He had walked through fire and emerged stronger, not because he was extraordinary, but because he refused to give up. Little did he know, the next chapter of his story would test him in ways he couldn't yet imagine. But whatever lay ahead, Samuel was ready. After all, he'd already proven that no matter how dark things got, light could always find a way through.